All right, so back to the reign of Pope Gregory the 13th. All right, so I mentioned at the end of the last class that a new source of trouble suddenly opened up in Portugal, and that was with the death of King Sebastian of Portugal in 1578. He left the throne to his uncle, who was a cardinal. So obviously that's going to have a problem if you have a cardinal on the throne. He's obviously not going to be married, so he's not going to have any offspring to inherit the throne after him. So what do we do? Well, the ministers of the king, the new king, urged him to actually marry. He's already a cardinal, to secure a direct succession to the crown. So although he's not a really crazy sort of person, so he is actually going to go through the regular channels trying to get a permission from the Pope in order to marry. So again, he's asking for a dispensation. Yes.
But he was a cardinal, but was he also a priest or just a cardinal?
It doesn't say here, but cardinals had to be at least deacons. So whether he was ordained or not to the priesthood, he was at least a deacon. Deacons are bound to celibacy. So you have to do more research to find what exactly orders he had received. But in any case, the minister of the king said, we really prefer, for the stability of transfer of power after you die, we'd like to see to it that you actually have an heir, a direct descendant who will inherit the throne after you. Because once you get into so somebody doesn't have any son, but instead a nephew, but then somebody else might have some other claim, it gets really messy. It's best to have for a monarch to have, if it's a hereditary monarchy, to have a male heir. I mean, that's why Henry VIII, that was part of his motivation for bringing the whole of England into schism. Part of his motivation was to have a male heir. That was one thing. So that's what the ministers are asking, and his cardinal, his name given as Henry. I don't know what it would be in Portuguese, but anyway, he asks for the necessary dispensation, and actually, I have it in my notes that he was actually an archbishop. So it was not a matter of simply dispensing, resigning the cardinal and dispensing a deacon. It was a matter of giving the dispensation to marry to an archbishop. That's what would have been necessary. I remember we talked about, I think I was doing a spiritual conference, but it said that, yes, the church does have the power to grant dispensation to someone even who has received major orders to marry, to reduce the lay state and then be free to marry. But the rule is that for subdeacons raro, in other words, rarely, for deacons rarius, more rarely, bishops numquam, never. So here we have not just any bishop, an archbishop and a cardinal. So an archbishop, a cardinal, and now also happens to be king of Portugal. So Gregory the 13th, he understood, he appreciated the weight of the reasons of state which were alleged for asking for this dispensation. But he was also aware of the consequences which would necessarily result from such an unprecedented departure from every canonical rule. So again, the church can grant such dispensations, but it'd be very bad to do that. Very bad idea. So Taras points out that the church, which had maintained, amid so many perils, the indissolubility of the marriage tie, must display the same firmness in guarding the indissolubility of the priestly vows. Again, it's actually somewhat debated whether it's a vow that is taken by priests or whether it's simply a law that's being obeyed. I believe St. Thomas comes down on the side of it's being a vow, but in any case, the point is the church very much has to guard the priestly celibacy as much as the indissolubility of the marriage tie, for the good of the church. Of course, the indissolubility of the marriage tie cannot be dissolved. Even a valid, consummated marriage cannot be dissolved even by the authority of the church. Whereas, of course, neither the priestly character cannot be erased from the soul by the authority of the church, but the celibacy is a disciplinary point, though, so the church could dispense from that, even to someone who has received major orders. But to do it for an archbishop and a cardinal that's going too far. And that was essentially the Pope's reply, Gregory XIII's reply to Henry's ambassador. And the cardinal, then upon having received that reply, turned around and then resisted all of the entreaties to the contrary. So first he said, okay, fine, I'll ask for a dispensation because you're asking me to. But then he gets the answer no. So he said, no, I'm not listening to that anymore. So one situation this actually turns out well. So another good thing that Dara says here is that political interests and considerations were broken upon the rock on which the Church of Christ is founded, and the world was not scandalized by the introduction of Protestant usages into the bosom of Catholicity. So again, not that the church absolutely didn't have the power to do it, but it would have been scandalous to do that. So the answer was no. So now we'll look at the single most famous thing of the pontificate of Gregory XIII, and that was the Reformation of the calendar, which we use to this day. And this is in the 16th century, late 16th century. And his reform of the calendar we still use to this day. Does anybody know the last country, at least last major country, to adopt the Gregorian calendar? Yes, which is why, interestingly enough, the October Revolution actually happened in November. Because the Julian calendar, which was a calendar, which was pretty good, but and we'll see in a minute what exactly the problems were. But it needed reform, and because it was falling behind, it wasn't keeping up with the actual course of the years. So it happened at that point, by 1917, that it was a different month altogether. At least when that came around, it was November according to the Gregorian calendar, the more accurate calendar, whereas according to the Julian calendar, which the Russians were following still, it was October. So that's why it's became known as the October Revolution, even though it actually happened according to the rest of the world in November. And even now, according to the Russians themselves, they in their history books they would say November. They would probably put a note that we weren't following that calendar at the time, but now they follow the Gregorian calendar just like everybody else, which is good because that would be really confusing otherwise. It's probably for that reason that they switched about a year after that. It was in 1918 that the USSR, the USSR at the time, finally adopted the Gregorian calendar, probably just for matters of reasons of convenience. Because it was actually, even early on, even England refused the Gregorian calendar. This is the time of Elizabeth, the horrible one, the really horrible one, anyway. You can argue about what the current Queen of England is. A lot of bad things have happened during her reign, but anyway, that's another story. The one who's very mention of her name is like vomit-inducing. That was still in the middle of her reign. So England and then also Russia, because they were schismatics, for example, perhaps there are other places too, refused the Gregorian calendar just because. It was an accurate calendar. Nobody would debate its accuracy, but just because. No, the Pope came out. It was the Pope spearheaded the effort to fix it, and they hate the Pope, so no, we're not taking it. That was their motivation. Okay, so from the time of the Council of Nicaea, which was in 325, and that's long before we started this year, about 1,000 years, about 1,100 years before where we started this year in the 15th century. Again, until the Reformation of the calendar in 1582, the era of computation had reached 10 days. In other words, the calendar had fallen 10 days behind what the actual day of the year was. I'll explain that in a second. So it says that the vernal equinox, in other words, the spring equinox, the point at which when spring is coming, winter ending, spring is coming, that the number of daylight hours is exactly equal to the number of nighttime hours, was announced for March 21st, which is to this day, but actually fell on March 11th in 1582. though it was still announced for the 21st. So it's supposed to be March 21st, the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. But instead it fell on the 11th. So they could tell the calendar is, in other words, it's supposed to be the 21st, but we know, just from keeping track of how much light shines in the sky for how long each day, that it's 10 days before that the actual length, daytime hours is exactly equal to nighttime hours. So is anybody ever familiar with that? The equinoxes versus the solstices, how that works? So the spring or the vernal equinox, because Verna, everyone familiar with the term Verna, like the vernal, pars verna of the breviary, the spring section of the breviary. Right now we're in the Iemalis, the winter section. So the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, is the one, again, it's in March, but the number of daytime hours is exactly equal to the number of nighttime hours. So half of the day exactly is nighttime, half the day exactly is, so nighttime exactly half daytime. The autumn solstice, autumn equinox is the day in September that's exactly the same thing. Whereas for winter, the winter solstice, which is coming up in the end of December, that's a day in which there is the least sunlight and the most darkness, the longest night of the year, basically, and the shortest day of the year. So that's the winter solstice, whereas the summer solstice, which happens in June, is the longest day of the year, the most sunlight with the least number of nighttime hours. So all that in mind, in 1582, this is the big year of the calendar reform, 1582, as always, the vernal equinox was announced for March 21st, but in fact fell on March 11th. So when we have this right here in March, half the day is nighttime, half the day is daytime, half the day is darkness, half the day is light, exactly. That's supposed to be March 21st. It actually fell on March 11th. And the reason for it basically is that, essentially the year is, we talk about the year being 365 days. It's actually 365 days plus about a few extra hours, and it's very specific, exactly the exact number of minutes and exact number of seconds in every year. The point is, it's a few hours more than 365 days. And when Julius Caesar had the calendar reformed, he had whoever he had do it rounded it up to about 365 days and about 6 hours, whereas that's 11 minutes longer. It's like 300. I have to find the exact, but it's essentially 365 days, 5 hours and 49 minutes every year. And but they rounded that up to 6 hours. So because of that, there was, through have it all figured out. Dara said it all figured out. It says, again, leaving out some stuff. So, having established that, a reform was evidently necessary, and Gregory called to his aid all the lights of science to effect it. He appointed a commission of all the most distinguished astronomers. So, everything's set now. So, basically, with the problem I mentioned before of 11 minutes in there, a lapse of 402 years would bring an error of 3 days. They figured that out, according to that system. So every 402 years, 3 days would be lost. So remember, this hasn't been fixed since 325, so that means there are now 10 days. You could do all the math and figure that out, but 325 to 1582, 10 days were lost because of that. And so the decision was made that to cut out 3 days of every 400 years. So okay, so we have this problem. We're getting the way to do this. We're getting the calendar is getting ahead really, because it's 11. We're 11 days before it's supposed to happen. The calendar is getting ahead. Cut out 3 days every 400 years will solve the problem. And they decided to disregard the other 2 years because somebody calculated that it would take 26,800 years to make the difference of 1 day. So don't worry about that, basically. If the world lasts that long, we'll deal with it when we get there. But no, effectively, it's not something anybody has to worry about. Especially now if you're living in 1582, but of course, even now, probably the world won't last that long. Looking the way things are looking now, but we'll see. None of us will be around to see it if it does. So, technically that's a defect, but it's such a small thing that just leave it aside. So everybody agreed essentially that 3 days had to be taken out of every 400 years. And so now another question is, how do we decide which years get the days removed? So they decide this, that it was agreed upon that it should fall, in other words, the year that would lose a day, a year that would lose a day, would fall upon the first 3 secular years of each period of 400 years. So a secular year is a year that begins a century. So like the year, the ones we'll talk about in a second, 1700, 1800, 1900, 2000. Those are all considered secular years. Now, it begins a new age, in a sense, a new century. So the year 1700 was the first one to feel that. So it was a day was taken out of that year. The year 1800 and also the year 1900. Of course, Dallas writing in the 19th century says that the year for him then the years 1900 and 2000 are of course still in the future. So he talks about them as being future. But basically 1700, 1800, 1900 all lost a day, but not the year 2000. So the idea is that these are all to fall on leap years. So years that there would be 366 days, just take one day away. You don't have to, like, oh, okay, so there are only 30 days in October this year. Don't have to worry about that. Just say, it would be a leap year. It's not going to be. But the year 2000, again, we've already had, starting year 1700, already had 3 of those days subtracted. Nothing had to be done in the year 2000. It was still a leap year. So that was the decision that was made. So if you're interested, it's taken from the United States Naval Observatory. The rule is basically that every year that is exactly divisible by 4 is a leap year. Right, that's easy. Except for years that are exactly divisible by 100. But to these centurial years are leap years if they are exactly divisible by 400. So that's the rule. Yeah, don't worry too much about that. If you want, you can go to the United States Naval Observatory website and read more about it. Again, all of the details of that are not terribly important. Just understand that there were essentially 10 missing days in the calendar by the time of Pope Gregory XIII, and he fixed it. Not only in his own year, but also for the rest of the existence of the world, he fixed it. So let's see, anything a little more explanation. So from the year 1582 until 1700, the old calendar was 10 days behind the new. The suppression of a day in 1700 made the difference for the whole of the 18th century, 11 days, and that of 1800 carried it to 12. Let's see, don't have to go on too much about that. So sometimes you might read about the old style versus the new style of computing time. The new style is Gregorian. The Gregorian calendar. So you hear the new style, that's 16th century new. That's considered new because it's started in the 16th century as opposed to old everything before that, at least from the time of Julius Caesar. All right, so that's basically what he did, and also. Again, the way he fixed it in the year of actual 1582 was he had basically decided that October 4th of that year, 1582, that at midnight, the point at which the 2 days meet, that the following day after that would be October 15th. That was how he decided that. So there was somebody very famous who actually died in that time, so you could give 2 different dates for this person's death. Anybody know who it was? Anybody? Yes.
Saint Teresa.
Yes, Saint Teresa of Avila. So she died at some point on the night between October 4th and 15th of 1582. So that's the story of that. All right, so. That might be a good extra credit question on a quiz sometime. Explain the rule for deciding which years that should be leap years or not, which ordinarily, yes.
How's all the public made aware of this? Just gradually?
I don't know, it had to be published, just like any other decree had to be published. Yeah, it's true. Speed of communications were slower at the time, but clearly you had to have all of the the monarchs of all these major nations agree to it, and they would subsequently let their subjects know. Because you see, obviously, Russia, they didn't take it until 1918. England didn't take it until later, all out of animosity to the Holy See, which they were at war with, in some sense. So something else that Gregory XIII did was, of course, this is very closely connected to the calendar, was the publication of the Roman Martyrology. So he was the one who published that for the first time. Of course, it's been updated many times since, but he was the one who published it. And also an interesting bit about prime, the reason that if anybody has anybody actually recited, say, the office for any day? Anybody tried to do that? No? Okay, well then you would know that, well, everybody was, let's see, who was here for the retreat last year? Probably everyone except for the first year, right? Okay. So you remember that, of course, we sing prime every morning, but we sang at least some of the other minor, they're called the little hours, terce, sext, and none. So prime, terce, sext, and none. Or like the little hours, or so you notice that anybody who was here for that would notice that those little hours, usually terce section is referred to as little hours, are different from prime. They're quite different from prime in certain ways. So in other words, prime actually has a lot more to it than those other ones do. It's very similar. I mean, they start out the same. It starts with Deus Nuggetorium, a hymn, antiphon, and 3 psalms, and then a responsory, short responsory, like the Christe Filii Dei Vivi. But then for the other hours, you have an oration, and that's it. Like the oration of the collect at Mass, and that's it. That's the end of it. Whereas prime, of course, you have a lot more than that. You have the singing of the Martyrology and everything. The reason that that's the case is because in prime, there are different stories about the origins of some of the hours. One of the stories is that at prime, in the monastic schedule, of course, they would get up at midnight to sing matins and lauds, and then they would have some free time in between that, and their Mass in the morning the next time they would come together for the office. They weren't supposed to sleep during that time, but it was, they got up at midnight, so some of them did. So some abbot decided, you know what, we're not going to make sure that nobody sleeps during that time. We're going to put another hour in there to make sure everybody is awake in the chapel. So instituted prime. That's one of the stories, anyway, for the origin of prime. But in any case, what did happen was, after a certain point, again, you would have, after the short responsory, you have that oration that seems like it should be the end. Looking at the other hours, it looks like it should be the end, but then it continues. It's because in monasteries, they would actually leave the chapel and go into a separate room for the chanting of the Martyrology and other prayers to go with it. But then eventually, but they would do that right after prime. Maybe if it was considered part of the hour or not, I'm not sure. But it was, in any case, it was done right after they would finish in the chapel. So after a while, it just became lumped together. We'll just do everything in the chapel, and it became part of the hour of prime, like officially part, whatever it was before or not. It was by then, definitely now, of course, it's part of the hour of prime. So that's why it seems like prime finishes, but then starts up again with the Martyrology, because all those things would have taken place in a different room entirely. And they call it the chapter room. So another interesting bit for you. They were talking about the Martyrology. So it was Cardinal Baronius who was entrusted with the task. And Baronius who wrote the Ecclesiastical Annals, who also knew, what famous person did he know? Yeah. Right. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about him in the biography of Saint Philip Neri that we had read a couple of years ago, talking about how Baronius did not want to write Ecclesiastical Annals. He really didn't want to, but Saint Philip Neri basically made him do it. Not sure if it was a penance or something, but because Saint Philip Neri would do that. He would give crazy penances. By the note, don't do that. A saint can get away with that, but for rest of us, that would be considered making the sacrament hateful to people, to give them strange penances. So don't try that. A saint can do that, but the rest of us don't do that. And in fact, they're really getting off here, but this is interesting. That there was a story of somebody, I think it was an American cleric, I'm not sure it was a priest, but he was at least a seminarian, who was traveling in Italy, and he went to confession and got as his penance to kiss the the base of the statue of Our Lady 5 times or something like that in the church. That was his penance. So I thought, that's strange. But then he went to go do it and saw all the old ladies in the church were all there kissing the steps. So that was just considered something perfectly normal. That you would just do that. It was just a normal devotion. So the priest sitting there probably didn't realize that, oh, maybe that's not the custom everywhere in the world. I just told him, oh yeah, just go do that. 5 times, it's a quick penance. But see, here you would never prescribe that as a penance. Here, don't. That's Merkelbach talks about it. Don't prescribe weird things for penance. That's one way to make the sacrament hateful to people, which is actually itself gravely sinful to make the sacrament hateful to somebody. Not supposed to do that. It's not to say that heavy penances are never warranted, but it does mean that you don't do anything that would basically turn people away from receiving the sacrament, and again, reasonably in the future. So, a note on that. But again, that being said, St. Philip you could give penances like, shave half your head, things like that. The time was people were especially vain about their hair. Like it was common for men to wear their hair longer and do stuff like that. So he would say, shave half your head or something. But he could get away with that because a saint, people do anything he would tell them to. So any odd penance like that, they would be, oh yes, fine, I'll do it, and it wouldn't make it hateful to them. So all of that because of Cardinal Baronius. So let's see. So yes, the brief of promulgation dated in February of 1584 enjoined that all patriarchs, archbishops, bishops, abbots, and superiors of churches conform to the new edition in the office and choir. So it seems that what Gregory XIII did was he promulgated a universal edition of the Roman Martyrology. There may have been local editions of their Martyrology, but he promulgated a universal one. Everybody used the same edition. Although that being said, you still do have local editions placed in, like the North American Martyrs. Those are placed in only in, say, the U.S. and Canada. And also, it's interesting that in Canada, St. John de Brébeuf is put first, whereas here St. Isaac Jogues, because St. Isaac Jogues died in upstate New York, or what's now upstate New York, whereas St. John de Brébeuf died in what's now Canada. So they basically the U.S. we get the one who died in the U.S. name him first. In Canada, the one who died in Canada name him first. Seriously. And they're also, of course, they put in the Martyrology where it's not mentioned elsewhere. And actually, we're coming up on another feast of actually the only American citizen to ever be canonized, Saint Francis Xavier Cabrini. It's December 22nd in the U.S. In the rest of the world, it's a ferial day before Christmas, but in the U.S. it's just double the second class. So yes, next I just mentioned the saints whose feasts are to be celebrated in certain places are not to be inserted in the Roman Martyrology and not in the Universal Edition. Their names were to be written in a separate book and afterwards placed in the order prescribed. So yeah, Father Duterte did that once. He made his own, because he had to chant the Martyrology as a seminarian. He made his own little booklet for all the feasts that we have to insert here. In fact, one of them even mentioned that there's some saint in the Diocese of Orlando, which this was, before Vatican II, this was the Diocese of Orlando. Novus Ordo made it the Diocese of St. Petersburg, but the Diocese of Orlando. But anyway, you have to figure out how to say, or I think it was Orlandenses. I have to say that. I saw that he had a note written on. I was trying to figure out how to do it. It came out as Orlandenses. So, yeah, it's talking about the feast celebrated in this diocese. So that was actually the last act of Gregory XIII's pontificate. He died in April 1585 after a reign of 12 years. So, fairly long reign. Especially this time, we've seen some popes lasted a couple of months, and some coming up soon. We'll cover fairly soon similar things. So okay, so then move on to Pope Sixtus V. His dates are April 24th, 1585, to August 27th, 1590. So, Thoris begins with his account of life of Pope Sixtus V with the observation that, I'm just talking about his time, while the modern world almost universally adopted the method of hereditary transmission of power, the Church alone, by her system of election, made the spiritual sovereignty attainable from every rank and every class of society. So, again, in his time, there were more hereditary monarchies still around than there are today. At least at his time, of course, in the mid-19th century, there were monarchies with real power still that were still in Europe. The jury had a number of empires in Europe at the time, and they were monarchies, of course, hereditary monarchies, which is normal. So it's interesting that he says this because, of course, even today, I mean, to become elected the president of a major nation, you have to still be of the upper levels of the hierarchy in that country. I mean, even it doesn't matter how much of a democracy a country says it is. There's always in every society, even in a communist society, there is a hierarchy. We can't get away from that. And really, when you think about it, every form of government is ultimately a monarchy. Whether it's one man or a group of people, somebody at the end of the day has to be calling the shots, as we say. Otherwise, nothing happens. Otherwise, if you go always have a further appeal, somebody else can call another vote. And if you can do that infinitely, ad infinitum, then nothing will ever get done. Somebody has to call the shots at the end of the day, for better or worse. If anything is going to happen, somebody has to be calling the shots. So you might have a group body of people who are ruling the country, like an oligarchy or something. But that's still ultimately a moral person rather than one single person, a moral body of people. Moral person in a sense. So, the reason he mentions this, and that's all sort of an aside, but the reason Daras mentions that in a time even when all of the major countries of the world were hereditary monarchies, whose monarchs had real power, that the Church made the system of sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty, attainable from every class and rank of society. In other words, anybody, of course, only men, of course, and then even then, you can't be a member of a heretical sect or something like that. But in theory, any man who's a member of the Church, of course, there's not other things too, like you can't be perpetually insane or anything like that, could be elected pope. So again, this, of course, it's still true, but even then, even in this time, mid-19th century, of course, it's always been true, but he's pointing out even at his time. So, and the reason he mentions it is that after having placed herself under the government of men surrounded with the splendor of birth and fortune, as we've seen in a lot of these, most of these posts, I mean, I'm trying to think of an exception, but most of them, the vast majority, they're all from wealthy families, famous names. So you have a few names from which these popes usually, Cardinal so-and-so, and we've seen that name 5 times before. They're all from the same families. It says, she did not hesitate, the Church, to stoop to the lowliest names and raise them to the papal throne. So it says that Sixtus V, who succeeded Gregory XIII, as I said, April 24th of 1585, was of this class. So it says that his ancestor had fled into Italy before the successful progress of Ottoman arms and settled at Montalto. So instead of being a wealthy Italian family, he's actually essentially a descendant of immigrants into Italy, and it's actually let's talk about it. He grew up as I've heard it said that he's a shepherd. He actually took care of pigs, so it wasn't even sheep. It was pigs, who of course have a lower reputation. Swineherd, as we call them in English, which sounds worse than shepherd, if you ask me. And also Sixtus V's father, whose name was Peretto Peretti, was obliged to leave that city on account of debt. So it wasn't even like they grew up, he was had a comfortable amount of wealth in the lower level of society. No, I mean he was poor, grew up a poor swineherd. So again, his son, whose name was Felice, was born to him outside of that city, Montalto, some distance away, who was to become Sixtus V, Pope Sixtus V. So his name was Felice in Italian. And he was too poor, Sixtus, or Felice, as he was at the time, of course, was too poor to enjoy even the advantages offered by the neighboring country school. So he was too poor to even get a basic education as a child. Amazing to think he became pope, but we'll see how that happened. So it was only by his own indomitable perseverance, we had a great amount of determination, that he managed to acquire a knowledge of reading and writing. And he watched his father's swine, took care of the pigs. And it was during those hours spent in the fields that he became his own teacher. So clearly he was intelligent and had a great deal of willpower if he taught himself to read and write while sitting among pigs. So it was this promising disposition which encouraged the Franciscan religious to adopt him, in other words, to bring him under his wing in a sense, and to undertake to draw out the treasures which he discovered in this youth's mind. So clearly he saw intelligence amongst, in a swineherd who taught himself to read and write in the 16th century. And having afterward been received into the order of his benefactor, so he was received into the Franciscans eventually, he distinguished himself in the General Franciscan Chapter of 1549 by a defense of some theological theses. So he's really made a name for himself among intellectuals. So his success on that occasion won him some notice and respect. There was a Cardinal Pio of Carpi, who was a patron of the Franciscans, who from that time espoused the interests of, still Felice Peretti, and his advance after that was rapid. St. Pius V raised him to the cardinalate, so you have a Pope saint who sees potential, good sign that there is, and consulted him in the most difficult cases. So I'd say he really has earned a reputation as an intellectual heavyweight, as it were. So after the death of St. Pius V, Cardinal Montalto, as he became known as, because of the city of his the city near which he was born, at any rate, he lived a secluded, quiet, frugal, though industrious life, devoting his time exclusively to study and meditation. But of course, you know what comes next. It was from this retreat that the hand of Providence drew him forth to rule the world. Of course, in a sense of these having the spiritual rule of the world. So, let's see. So, again, we saw it, and he was very determined, very persevering, and he possessed all of the qualities necessary to rule the church. And when he was reminded of the custom of distributing money among the people on the accession of a new pontiff, he replied, "That custom always occasions some evils. It is the most robust and not the most needy who sees the money." So, in other words, these members of rich Italian families, they would become elected, they would then start handing out money to their friends who are also rich. So he decided, I'll give the money to poor people instead. So he ordered the amount usually spent in such largesses to be distributed in the abodes of the poor and the hospitals. So it's interesting, this brings to mind the fact that, of course, we talk about in order to gain an indulgence to something, it's necessary to pray for the intentions of the Roman Pontiff. Of course, we don't currently have one. It's been a while since we have. And nice as that would be to have one again, there's Probably be a while yet. But in any case, you can still pray for the intentions of the Roman Pontiff because they are the extirpation of heresy, the propagation of the faith, but also the alleviation of the sufferings of the poor. Whereas for Bergoglio, it's probably more like the extirpation of the faith, the propagation of heresy, and the spread of communism throughout the world, or something. Those are his intentions. But we're praying for the intentions of a Roman Pontiff, not for Jorge Bergoglio's intentions. So that's why you can still do that. But you can see why. This is an example of a pope who provided for that. Yes. Yes, the propagation of the faith, the extirpation of heresy. That's one usually going first. The extirpation of heresy, the propagation of the faith, and alleviation of the sufferings of the poor. The joke is that Bergoglio would be the exact opposite of all those. I mean, it is. Right? He's manifested that. He's manifested all of those things I said. I didn't use any imagination to come up with those. But anyway, what brought it to mind was the fact we see a pope providing for that. But actually, you see other listings of intentions of the Holy Father also. Like one of them is peace among Christian princes, which, given what we've been studying, you see why a pope would be habitually praying for that to happen. But again, those things could change from time to time because you would have typically have, and even before Vatican II, they still had these lists. So these are the presumed intentions of the Roman Pontiff, of the Holy Father, and you pray for those whenever you have to pray for the intentions of the Holy Father, unless it's otherwise specified. That's what you would see a lot. It's probably nowadays you won't see the listing of peace among Christian princes anymore because there really aren't any. It's a little hard to pray for peace among people who don't exist currently. But that's one listing I've seen. That was one of the intentions among them. So that you might see some variation among those things, but those what I mentioned right now are ones that you would find almost always among them. Can't imagine you'd ever not find those. Of course, Bergoglio does talk a lot about it's the poor, taking care of the poor, but it's all out of a motive of socialism, of essentially wanting to set up the reign of the Antichrist. He said in his most recent encyclical is basically one of his, I think it's still the most recent one. I'm not sure he's published another, but he did say that basically calling on the Antichrist to come and rule the earth, essentially. So he's very much interested in setting up a worldwide communist regime that the Antichrist can then take advantage of. So when he talks about alleviating the sufferings of the poor or anything to that effect, he's talking about setting up a socialist, a welfare state that takes care of everybody. Everybody's dependent on it. That's what he's talking about. Anyway, so the peace and security of the pontifical states. So remember, we're still in a time when the papal states are still ruled by the Roman Pontiff. They had been disturbed by numberless banditti, so bandits were running around, remnants of the Guelph and Ghibelline contests. So yes, you have different parties, and then you'd have subdivisions within those parties. So let's see, Gregory XIII had distributed strong bodies of troops through the Roman Campagna, so the areas ruled by the Roman Pontiff. Remember, the Roman Pontiff was the sovereign ruler, the temporal ruler of the papal states, which makes all the sense in the world that the church have states like that to support her in order to carry on the apostolate. Which is why you might hear from the Novus Ordo that it was a good thing that those revolutionaries in the 19th century essentially stole the papal states from the Pope, so the church could focus more on spiritual matters. Which is utter nonsense, because you need resources to care for those spiritual things, like to build churches. You don't just do that out of thin air. If you've ever been to Rome and you see any of the churches, you realize that it cost an awful lot. It must have cost an awful lot to build these. Of course, there were huge amounts of donations that were given to the church for that to happen, but you just see the amount of resources that were poured into building those churches is enormous. But even if you're not building, enormous churches in Rome, there's a lot to provide for among all the clergy, and providing for their sustenance, and then everything that goes into the sacred liturgy, and of course the defense of the church, which at the time, and there was a papal army. in the Papal States. The Pope had his own forces. Yeah, they didn't typically do all that well, but they did exist. I mean, for many battles, the Papal troops lost a lot, and it's true. Unfortunately, but yes.
Father, which one was the anti-papal faction?
I'd have to read more about that, but yes, I forget. It's like clipping a coin. They both start with G. I forget which one, but yes. And I remember that there was somebody who was famous of the anti-papal faction. Yes, yes, yes. I forget which one it is. Yes, I'd have to check. But in case, yes, he was. Yes, Dante was one of those, and he was of the anti-papal faction. Let's see. Okay, so and Gregory XIII had done that. Sixtus disbanded the greater part of these troops, maybe because they weren't, maybe because it just wasn't necessary anymore. It's not exactly clear why. But he announced that no pardon would be granted during his reign to anyone guilty of a crime against persons or property. The threat was speedily followed by its execution, and the fear inspired by the stern justice of the Pope effectually put an end to all trouble from the brigands. So, see, exemplary punishment works. That's one of the motives for punishment, or at least for capital punishment. Public capital punishment is to not only to punish a heinous crime, which is heinous in itself, but also to let everybody else know, if you do that, you see what's going to happen to you. Seriously, that's one of the motives for it. So he did that, and he probably captured a few bandits that were marauding and pillaging and whatnot, had them publicly executed, and then the others thought, okay, he's really serious about putting an end to this. Better not get caught doing it. Of course, a good way to not get caught committing a crime is to not commit the crime. So they settled down. So yeah, and instead of having large numbers of troops constantly on the ready, he just had a few of these brigands executed and took care of it, largely. So Sixtus availed himself of the tranquility to bring about further disciplinary reform in Rome. He wished to give a lasting glory to his pontificate, so he enforced the rules concerning the College of Cardinals against nepotism. He increased the Vatican Library, and we saw that that was originally founded by for humanist motives, but I mean, in itself, it's not a bad thing to have a library in the Vatican. Drew forth from, amidst the ruins which covered them, the splendid monuments of ancient art, ordered a new edition of the Septuagint, and the revision of the Vulgate promised at Trent. He reorganized the public administration by instituting 15 congregations to manage all business. But he did that in 1588. He raised up the great obelisk brought by order of Caligula from Egypt to Italy, and furnished the city with a plentiful supply of water by the aqueduct of the Quirinal. So, in other things he's doing in Rome, in the city itself, cleaning things up, making things more disciplined among the clergy, among the cardinals especially, but generally just, say, even helping the water supply of the city. For building an aqueduct. All right.